A millionaire accidentally passed by a gas station and handed a runaway boy a loaf of bread, and what he discovered afterward shocked him to the core. Where in the world are you listening from? Leave us a comment to let us know. And now, let's begin. Clang! The sharp sound of a porcelain cup shattering on the tiled floor froze the air in the kitchen, like someone had just held their breath mid-sentence. White ceramic shards scattered across the floor, twirling slightly before lying still, as if they had just completed their mission, signaling that something terrifying was about to unfold. Elijah Carter, 10 years old, stood still, his hands frozen mid-air like they had just released something. His eyes were fixed on the shattered pieces, his palm still retaining the warmth of the cup he had held. He knew he hadn't just broken a household object, he had fractured the dangerous silence that hung in this house. A soft creak echoed from the living room, and Elijah didn't need to look to know who was coming. Edward Carter, his father, appeared at the doorway like a slab of dark stone, unmoving and cold. Edward didn't need to speak to be frightening. Just his presence was enough. Back straight. White dress, shirt, buttoned all the way to the top like he'd just come from church. Everything about him was rigidly neat. Slicked back hair, clean-shaven chin, shoes that always gleamed. But what chilled Elijah the most were his grey eyes, not angry, not emotional, just quietly watching, as if waiting for a mistake to justify punishment. He didn't go to church to pray, but to reaffirm his right to judge others. And in this house, Elijah was always the one being judged. His father stared at him for a few seconds, not harshly, but enough to make Elijah feel exposed, as if standing naked in a freezing gust of wind. "You again," Edward said softly. "The Lord's dishes aren't for careless hands." Before Elijah could respond, the scraping sound of slippers came from deeper inside the house, followed by a woman's voice, dry and brittle like tree bark. What did that brat break this time? Lucille Carter, Edward's mother, Elijah's grandmother, stepped out, holding a porcelain teacup with golden patterns. She was a small woman, physically fragile, but her eyes were sharp and calculating, always weighing whether to cut or to overlook. To her, raising a child meant pain, and discipline was a tradition. Only through beatings could things be fixed. "That's the third one this week," she said with a sigh that ended like a verdict. "You'd better teach him properly." Edward didn't reply, didn't argue. He simply stepped forward and raised his hand. "Brat," he ordered, "left hand out." Elijah hesitated for a second, then obeyed. He was right-handed, but the left hand was the one reserved for punishment. It was one of those unspoken rules in this house, never said aloud, but never forgotten. Edward grabbed a stainless steel spoon from the dining table and slammed it down in front of his son. The metallic clang against the wood made Elijah flinch slightly. "Don't make your mother ashamed to have a son like you." Lucille let out a faint laugh, soft like a spoon stirring tea, but icy cold. "You're too soft on him. Sooner or later he'll turn out just like his mother." Her name, Rachel, was a forbidden thorn in this household. Rachel Carter had once been a gentle woman, soft-spoken, never raised her voice, and never once received affection or respect from these two people. She had died from a strange illness 2 years ago, but Elijah had never believed that story. Edward raised his hand again. Elijah didn't move, only glanced towards the cupboard, where a faded photo frame lay hidden behind a sheet of foil. A picture of his mother. Her eyes in the photo still smiled, though that smile had long been buried under dust and silence. The first blow landed. Elijah didn't cry. The second came harder, then the third, the fourth, and after that, he lost count. He didn't feel pain the usual way anymore. It was just a wave of searing heat spreading out and then vanishing. as if his body had become so familiar with these beatings that it simply shut down the feeling in order to survive. An hour later, the kitchen returned to its usual stifling silence. Elijah sat curled in the corner, eyes fixed on the gap beneath the cupboard, where a shard of porcelain still lay untouched. Outside, the rain began to fall, and wind howled through the cracks in the door. Elijah looked up at the ceiling, at the small lightning-shaped crack, a spot he had stared at hundreds of times before. After every beating, it was the only place his eyes would go. But this time felt different. As Edward turned his back, Elijah caught sight of his grandmother's face. Not angry, not scolding, but satisfied. In that moment he understood no one in this house wanted him to get better. They didn't need him to be good. They needed him to be silent and endure. He whispered quietly to himself, "I won't die here. I won't become my mother. I won't be buried under a name. No one speaks anymore." When darkness had fully swallowed the neighborhood, Elijah tiptoed to the kitchen cabinet and pulled out an old backpack. Inside was only a soft piece of fabric, cut from his mother's dress, and an empty plastic bottle. Quietly, he opened the back door and slipped through the freezing gust. He didn't know where he would go. He only knew this: staying meant dying. The wooden door shut behind him. No one called his name. No one noticed he had disappeared. Because in that house, the name Elijah had never truly existed. The night rain poured down on Marrowfield Forest like a heavy curtain, drowning out every sound in a thick mist. No one could hear anything beyond the steady fall of rain, and no one would have imagined that a 10-year-old boy was running through it, alone, soaked, and trembling. There was no light, no voices calling, only the soft footsteps of Elijah Carter, treading on rotting leaves, trying not to make a sound. 30 minutes earlier, he had left the house where he'd grown up. The house where no one had called him by his real name for years. The back door had closed behind him, like it was sealing off part of his memory. Elijah didn't look back, didn't allow himself to. Beneath the dripping canopy, he ducked low, pressing himself into the roots of trees, his eyes never leaving the branches that blocked his path. He had no map, no flashlight, only instinct, an instinct raised by fear. He stayed away from the dirt road leading to town, keeping himself hidden in the shadows. If someone happened to drive by and saw a child wandering alone, they might stop, but not to help. It could be Lucille. It could be his father. The thought of Edward Carter made Elijah freeze mid-step. The chill on his skin was nothing compared to the sting at the back of his neck when he imagined his father standing just behind him. His hands were rough, but his voice was soft like a church hymn. And that softness was what made Elijah's skin crawl. In the woods, the smell of wet earth mixed with moss and tree resin created a thick, suffocating air. Every time a branch brushed his face, he flinched, thinking someone was grabbing his sleeve. And each time the wind hissed through the leaves, Elijah turned his head, checking behind him. Once, he thought he heard someone calling his name. "Elijah!" He stopped dead in his tracks. No one was there, only the wind weaving through tilted trunks. But inside him, that call sliced through his memory like a blade. After nearly an hour of trudging through the forest, Elijah was exhausted. He stopped at a fallen tree, sat down, and exhaled sharply, then forced himself to rise again. He knew if he sat too long, he'd never get up again. A sudden rustle came from a nearby bush. He jumped to his feet, stepping back on instinct. From the darkness emerged a small, stray dog, its fur matted and wet, golden eyes glowing faintly in the night. They stared at each other, one drained, the other starving. Elijah didn't run. He simply raised his hand slowly. The dog didn't bark. It growled softly, then turned away, vanishing like it had never been there. But even that brief encounter was enough to send tremors through Elijah's body, like claws scraping his skin. Around midnight, he reached a low slope where a narrow trail cut through a thinning patch of forest. There, for the first time, Elijah saw firelight, a small flicker near the base of a moss-covered tree. Dean Foster, a homeless man known to drift around the woods, was sitting there, leaning against a torn backpack, smoking his last cigarette. The townspeople had called Dean many things: lunatic, drifter, wife-killer. But Elijah didn't know any of that. He only saw a stranger in the forest, and that was enough to make him stop in place. Dean looked up at Elijah. "Storm like this, and someone still out wandering," he said quietly, his voice hoarse but not threatening. Elijah stood nearly 20 paces away. He didn't move. His heart pounded. One foot had gone numb, but he kept his balance. Dean slowly raised his hand, making no move to approach. "If you're running from someone, I won't ask questions," he said, voice steady. "Just letting you know there's a small stone ridge ahead. Follow that, and you'll avoid the patrol road if you want to keep moving." Elijah gave a small nod, the first response he'd made since leaving home, but he didn't say anything, and he didn't come closer to the fire. He kept walking, swallowed by the darkness, never once looking back. Dean watched him go, then muttered under his breath, "Didn't cry. Just like I used to be." Elijah kept walking. His back ached, his knees burned, but he felt more certain as he moved past the thick shrubs. Just as Dean had said, there was a small rocky slope. He held onto tree branches to climb, slipping several times, but he didn't give up. The sky began to pale. The fog thickened, blurring everything in front of him. But in that thin, cold air, there was a strange smell: oil, rusted iron, and old gasoline. A mixture Elijah had never known in the forest. He turned left. A few minutes later he saw it, a small, run-down gas station. The red neon sign flickered weakly, part of the signboard broken off. No one was watching, no cars, just a stained wall in the back and a rusted fuel pump. Elijah moved around back and found a hidden corner between two walls. He sat down, placed his backpack on his lap, and held it tightly, as if everything left in the world was inside it. He fell asleep there, among the smell of oil, the drifting fog, and the gentle wind. He didn't know this place would become a turning point, that for the first time in his life, someone would stop and truly see him. The morning sun in the countryside rarely shone brightly. It brushed lightly over the old tin roof, casting a pale grey light onto the dusty glass window of Highway 87's gas station, like ashes that hadn't settled. One ray of sunlight touched Elijah's half-closed eyes, as thin as silk, but enough to make him stir slightly, then open his eyes slowly, like someone returning from a nameless dream. No one saw that moment. Inside the station, Tyler, a young attendant in his early 20s, was chewing gum with one earbud in. When he noticed Elijah through the fogged glass, he rolled his eyes. "Hey, you see that kid out there?" Tyler said to a friend standing behind the counter. "Another one?" The other shrugged, probably waiting for his parents. Tyler smirked, opened a cabinet, and pulled out a half-full water bottle. He stepped outside, tossed the bottle toward Elijah. It rolled a few times and stopped at the boy's shoes. "Here, drink it or don't. Just don't sit there all day," Tyler said without pausing, then turned back inside like he'd just taken out the trash. Elijah didn't pick it up right away. He stared at the bottle for a long time, as if debating whether it was drinkable, or more truthfully, whether he was worthy of picking it up. A silver minivan pulled up to pump number 3. From the back seat, a curly-haired little girl pointed toward Elijah. "Mommy, that boy's sitting on the ground." The woman turned, hesitated for a second, then gently pulled her daughter back into her seat. "Don't look. Good children don't stare at other people's business." The car window slowly slid up, closing the view between the curious child's eyes and the mother's empty stare. A truck driver stepped down, holding a hot coffee he had just bought. "What's with the kid out there?" he asked Tyler as he passed by. Tyler shrugged while popping open a soda. "Since early morning. Didn't say anything, didn't ask, just sat there." "Better hope the press doesn't catch wind of it," the man muttered before returning to his cabin. He shut the door with his elbow, revved the engine, and drove off like pushing the problem out of his mind. No one stopped. No one came close. Elijah pulled up his hood to block the sun. He drew spirals in the dusty ground, then wiped them away, then drew them again, over and over. In this gas station, people came and went. They left behind the smell of gasoline, the scent of instant coffee, and the echo of car horns. No one asked him anything. No one cared. And strangely, that made Elijah feel safer than anywhere he'd ever been. He no longer had to listen for footsteps in the house, no longer had to guess an adult's mood before speaking, no longer had to brace himself every time he heard the sound of a breaking glass, a spoon dropping, or a door slamming in the middle of the night. There was no one here to call his name in that empty tone, as if it didn't belong to a person, but just another task waiting to be dealt with. The spot behind the gas station was cold, hard, and rough. No one here loved him, but no one touched him with a strangling hand or spoke to him with a voice soaked in bitterness. A light breeze passed by, carrying the scent of old gasoline, dust, and a faint whiff of bread from a food cart across the road. Elijah didn't lift his head, but he thought he heard footsteps, not rushed like all the others before. They were slow, steady, low footsteps. Not too close, not too far. He didn't look up, but for the first time in days, he wasn't afraid of footsteps. The early countryside wind blew dry across Highway 87's gas station, carrying with it the smell of oil, the chill of morning air, and a hint of fried shallots from Gloria's bread cart across the street. Her red food truck always parked in the same spot every Monday. Warm bread, cheap coffee, and old jazz music playing from a cassette radio, as if everything had become a ritual for passing truckers. A silver-grey Lincoln Continental rolled to a stop. The engine shut off. The door opened. Mr. Whitmore, well past 60, stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, a man who looked like he was used to carrying heavy things. Not just physically, his face was stern, carved with deep lines around the eyes, not from laughter, but from having seen too much and said too little. He had once been one of the wealthiest men in the state, owning a chain of properties stretching from Chicago to Seattle, once dubbed the Silent Tycoon by Forbes for his fortune and quiet life. He walked toward the pump, ready to fill his tank, when he suddenly stopped, spotting a small figure slumped against the wall behind the pump, hunched over, head bowed, an old jacket, arms wrapped tightly around a torn backpack. "Who's that boy?" he asked, his voice deep and calm, not quite concern, more like genuine attention. Tyler, the station attendant, wearing earbuds and wiping the glass display, shrugged. "Been here for days. Doesn't talk, doesn't ask for anything. Everyone sees him, but everyone's in a hurry." Mr. Whitmore was silent for a few seconds. He looked at the child again, still, wordless, as if the world had turned him into stone. Then he turned and walked to Gloria's food truck. He picked up a still warm baguette and simply said, "No butter, thanks." Then he came back. Elijah had seen him already. He'd heard the talking, and like always, he braced himself, ready to tense up if the stranger came too close. But this time, the man didn't rush, didn't raise his voice, didn't stand too near. He just walked over, stopped at a respectful distance, and extended his hand, the bread resting gently on his palm, still warm. "Would you like something to eat?" the man asked, his voice low, firm. "You don't have to say anything. Just stay." Elijah looked at him. It was a strange kind of gaze. No pressure, no pity. Not the kind of look he was used to. The glance that flicked over him like he wasn't there. This was the first time in a very long while that someone's eyes stayed on him. He lowered his head, took the bread with both hands, said nothing, just sat still. Mr. Whitmore gave a soft nod and turned to go. At that moment, a small truck parked across the street. A woman stepped out, silver hair tied neatly, thin frame, carrying 2 shopping bags from the market. Elijah glanced up, then lowered his gaze again. But just then, his eyes met hers. Lucille Carter, his grandmother. In that split second, his breath caught. His body went rigid. Everything around him seemed to blur. The voices, the cars, the wind. He couldn't hear anything. Only her eyes, cold, hard, sharp as hot iron. Eyes he had known too well from rainy nights, from uneaten dinners, from beatings that came without reason. Elijah yanked his hood down over his face, backed up against the wall, his heart pounding like it might burst. He started to tremble, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was instinct to escape, his body reacting to danger before his mind could catch up. He knew, if she saw him, if she called his name, he'd be dragged back. No one would believe him, no one would defend him, and it would be another night like the last, or worse. From a distance, Mr. Whitmore saw it too. He saw the boy trembling, his eyes no longer empty, but filled with a silent desperation, the same look he had once worn, the night his mother left and never came back when he was 12. He looked at the bread clutched in the boy's hands like it was a life preserver. Just then, Elijah turned and looked at him, a look so urgent it didn't need words. Mr. Whitmore walked over slowly. "You don't have to explain," he said, voice calm but firm. "I don't know what you've been through, but if you need help, I'm here." Elijah stood. His hand clenched the strap of his backpack. He didn't speak, didn't cry, but he walked toward the man, on his own, like he had just opened a door he'd thought had never existed. When the Lincoln rolled away from the gas station, Lucille had already turned away, not realizing. Elijah sat in the back seat, his face against the window, not looking back even once. He didn't know where they were going, but for the first time in a very long while, he knew he wouldn't return. The scent of old pine wood and a quiet light slipping through the curtain slats were the first things that touched his senses as he stepped into the house. Mr. Whitmore's home wasn't large, but it was orderly and quietly warm, as if it had once been filled with laughter. Laughter now folded away neatly in some drawer, no longer loud, but never gone. Mr. Whitmore set the boy's backpack by the door, then silently walked to the kitchen, where he started boiling water. He asked no questions, gave no instructions. The house seemed to understand that the boy needed time. Time to get used to everything, including himself. Elijah stood still in the foyer, his eyes gliding over the simple furniture. A worn armchair, a grandfather clock stopped at 10:15, a neat stack of old books by the fireplace. On a small shelf, he saw a photo frame, a woman with a gentle smile and soft, curly blonde hair. The frame was engraved with the name Martha. A little while later, Mr. Whitmore placed 2 mugs of hot water on the table, one for himself, one for the boy. Then, as if just remembering something important, he asked softly, "I don't know what to call you." The boy looked up, for the first time, straight into his eyes. There was a flicker of hesitation, then he spoke, very quietly. "Elijah, here is the English translation of the continuation of your story, keeping the length, emotional tone, and structure intact. All sentences are grouped into 4 to 5 sentence paragraphs as requested, and the dialogue is integrated naturally within the text. Mr. Whitmore gave a slight nod, as if that name had just completed a missing puzzle piece. The name stirred something deep within him, a memory of a younger brother who had gone missing when they were both children. It was the first time he had ever known what helplessness truly felt like. "Elijah," he repeated, voice low. "Would you like to take a shower? Bathrooms at the end of the hall." When the boy walked away, Mr. Whitmore remained seated, his hand gently tightening around the mug. In his mind, old images resurfaced. The old house in Missouri, the scent of wood, the wind whistling through winter cracks, and a small boy, himself, hands purple from cold, curled near the fireplace, listening to his father shout while trying not to cry. The memory didn't awaken pity. It reminded him that some children don't need pity. They just need someone patient enough to sit with them in silence. Elijah walked slowly over the creaking wooden floor. Inside the bathroom, he locked the door carefully, as though afraid someone might barge in. The hot water flowed down his skin and made him shiver. It felt like being stripped of the layers of dust and fear still clinging to him. Elijah stood under the water for a long time, letting it run through his hair, over his shoulders, across bruises that still ached. His hands rested against the rim of the tub, trembling, not clearly from cold, but from something deeper, a wordless emotion he'd tried not to feel, now rushing back with every drop. Mr. Whitmore didn't knock again. He simply placed a folded pair of pajamas and a clean towel outside the bathroom door, then quietly returned to the living room. By the window, an old cat named Murphy, the cat Martha had left behind, hopped onto the chair and nuzzled against his hand. The aging cat lived silently in the house, a quiet witness to all that had passed. "This boy, maybe he just needs more time," Mr. Whitmore muttered, as if speaking to the cat. When Elijah came out, his hair still wet, his old clothes folded in his arms, he saw the man reading under a warm yellow light. Without looking up, Mr. Whitmore spoke. "Room to the right. Door's not locked. If you want to lock it, there's a latch inside." The small bedroom had a single bed by the window. The beige blanket was clean and carried the scent of old sun. On the wall was an oil painting of a meadow at sunset. No TV, no whispers, only a quiet so deep it felt like an invisible embrace. Elijah sat on the bed, his eyes scanning the room again, then paused at a photo of Martha, an old picture, slightly faded, beside a small pot of cactus. He touched the frame gently. He didn't know why, but her face calmed him, like when his mother used to place her hand on his forehead to check for fever. That night, Elijah didn't cry. He just lay still, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, and in a half-dream, somewhere between sleep and waking, he felt a hand on his forehead. Not cold, not heavy, not painful. A hand resting there quietly, like a promise that morning would come, and that he'd still be here, in a place where no one wakes you by shouting. For the first time in many nights, Elijah fell asleep. No nightmares, no darkness, just a sleep with a door and a wall that stayed warm. If you could sit with Elijah for one quiet afternoon, what would you offer him? If you'd choose gentleness, comment tea. If you'd offer warmth, comment hug. Morning in Marrowfield kept its usual stillness, but the air carried something different, as if the town was holding its breath, waiting for something unspoken to unfold. Sunlight streamed through the thin mist, settling on old wooden rooftops and porch rails. The wind moved through the turning maple leaves in quiet patience, like it was waiting for something to change. At the house on the edge of town, Mr. Whitmore poured 2 cups of hot tea. Standing by the bedroom door, he knocked gently. "Elijah," Time to get up. Breakfast's ready. There was no answer. He pushed the door open and saw Elijah still curled up in the blanket, his eyes wide open, staring silently at the ceiling. Mr. Whitmore placed the tea on the bedside table. "Did you dream of anything?" he asked softly. Elijah shook his head. When he sat up, the collar of his shirt slipped from his shoulder, revealing dark bruises along his back. Mr. Whitmore froze. "Elijah," he said, his voice hoarse, "what happened to you?" Elijah pulled the shirt back up and lowered his head, saying nothing. Mr. Whitmore sat beside him, keeping a careful, respectful distance. "If someone did this to you, I need to know. Not to judge, to help." A moment passed. Then Elijah spoke quietly. "I got beaten. At home." No more words were needed. Mr. Whitmore took him straight to Brant Clinic, where Nurse Lucy Brant, a woman in her 40s, gently tended to every bruise on Elijah's body. The wounds were layered, old over new, impossible to explain away as accidents. Here is the full English translation of your latest scene, carefully structured into 4 to 5 sentence paragraphs, with natural integration of dialogue, while preserving tone, atmosphere, and character emotion, exactly as in your original Vietnamese text. Lucy stepped out, her face somber, her eyes faintly red as if she'd just held something back. She held Elijah's medical file in one hand, fingers lightly gripping the edge of the papers. "There are signs of long-term abuse," she said, her voice rough, not just from anger, but from heartache. In her eyes was a complex mix of professionalism, instinct, and a genuine heavy regret. Someone should have seen this earlier. Mr. Whitmore nodded. "Elijah, can you tell her what happened?" The boy stayed quiet for a moment, then whispered, "It was my stepfather and my grandmother. They hit me when I didn't do my homework, when I spilled water, when I didn't say anything." Lucy stood, then spoke softly to Whitmore. "I have to call the police. This is serious." "Do it," he replied. "I'll handle the rest." By the time Sheriff Nolan arrived, Elijah was still sitting on the exam table, arms wrapped around himself. "What's your name, son?" Nolan asked. "Elijah Carter. Edward Carter's your father, stepfather, and Lucille Carter is my grandmother. Can you take care of this boy?" the sheriff asked. "I won't just take care of him," Mr. Whitmore replied. "He's part of my family now. He didn't come into my house by blood, but by trust, and I won't let anyone hurt him again." On the way back, Nolan stopped at Holloway's grocery. June was restocking the cookie shelf when she saw him walk in. "Morning, Nolan. Something wrong?" "June, have you ever seen a boy with Edward Carter?" "Yes. He used to walk past here. Lately, not anymore. Before that, he always had his head down. Quiet. Once I saw his hand bandaged, his eye bruised. I asked, but he didn't say anything. Did you think something was off?" "I suspected. But now, I'm sure." "Do you remember the last time you saw him?" 2 weeks ago, light rain. He was standing under the awning. I gave him a packet of cookies and he thanked me. So softly. Haven't seen him since." "Would you be willing to testify?" "Yes, I'll speak the truth." The air in Marrowfield no longer held its usual morning calm. Rumors had crept past white picket fences, tapped gently on doors, and settled into ears leaning over counters. No one spoke openly, but many now knew something had happened to the boy from the Carter house. Linda Harper, a part-time reporter for the local paper, had worked with Sheriff Nolan on a few child abuse cases. She had once uncovered a buried case in a neighboring county the previous year. Nolan trusted her instinct and persistence, though at times her stubbornness exhausted him. That morning, he called Linda. "I need you. It's about a kid again. You remember the Carter boy? The one Mr. Whitmore found at the gas station?" she asked. Yes, he's the victim. I need to collect statements. I want you to come with me, not for the paper, just to find the truth. Linda nodded over the phone, her voice firm. I'm in. For the boy. In the crisp afternoon air, they began their investigation. Their first stop was the home of Violet Dobbins, a widow who had lived next door to the Carters for 20 years. Mrs. Violet, Linda said, I'm not here to write a headline. I just want to know, have you ever heard anything from that house? Mrs. Violet hesitated, her hands twisting a worn cloth in her lap. Yelling, late at night. Not just once. I wanted to call the police, but my husband told me not to. Don't get involved in other people's business. He's gone now, and I think maybe I shouldn't stay silent. Linda nodded quietly, taking notes. Mrs. Violet glanced around nervously, as if afraid someone might be watching, then whispered, But don't say it was me. I'm scared. That family, they're not the kind you want trouble with. Here is the English translation of your powerful and emotional continuation. The paragraphs are structured in 4 to 5 sentence blocks, with all dialogue and emotional weight preserved as requested. At the edge of town, Pete Langley, owner of the old mechanics shop, opened a dusty wooden drawer and pulled out a worn child's sweater, dried blood staining the back near the shoulder. I found this after a rainy night, near the trash bin next to the Carter house. I kept it. I don't know why. Maybe because my wife cried when she saw it. Linda took it with both hands, saying nothing. But her eyes said enough. Meanwhile, at the small cafe on Route 3, Kyle Richardson, now an electrician in the city, was back visiting his mother. Hearing the rumors, he went straight to Sheriff Nolan. I was in 5th grade with Mr. Carter. He used to teach PE. One time I dropped a water bottle. He hit me with a wooden ruler. Not a warning tap. It was so hard I couldn't sit for 2 days. My mum went to the principal, but Mr. Carter said it was religious discipline. That was the end of it. Nolan wrote it down, his face dark with thought. These small, seemingly scattered pieces were starting to align. Out in West Marrowfield, the old rental room of the Carter family was still locked. Maggie Sanders, the landlady, initially refused to talk. But after Linda returned a 3rd time, she finally opened the door. I don't know anything, she said quickly, but her hands shook as she pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside was an old notebook, its edges frayed, pages filled with handwriting. I wrote down. Every time Elijah came back bruised, I was scared. They threatened me. But now, I think that boy deserves a life. Linda held the notebook like something sacred. She made no promises, but her eyes lit with resolve. And then, most unexpectedly, inside a white-painted cabinet worn with age, in the room Elijah once stayed. A letter was found hidden behind a loose wooden panel. Maggie had dropped an old photo while cleaning for the new tenant, and when she bent down to pick it up, she noticed the looseness in the board. Behind the dust, there was a crumpled envelope labeled, "For anyone brave enough to listen." Linda's hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was feminine, slender, uneven, rushed. I'm not allowed to make calls. Not allowed out alone. They say I'm a disgrace. I don't know how much longer I can take this. If someone finds this letter, please help my son. Please. When Linda returned to the car, Nolan was waiting. She placed the notebook and letter on the seat beside him, exhaling deeply. Is it enough? She asked. Nolan didn't answer right away. He pushed his seat back, gazing out the window into the pale sunlight. I'll file for a search warrant. But Linda... I know, she interrupted. I'll be careful. But if this gets buried again, that boy won't get another chance. He nodded. For the first time in a week, his eyes weren't wary. They were full of understanding. Back at the Carter house after Elijah had vanished, no one in town saw Edward or Lucille show any concern. They didn't report him missing. They didn't ask the neighbors. The house still opened every morning. The chimney still smoked, but the air around it had grown cold. A neighbor recalled, "Lucille told me he ran off to learn a lesson. Edward said, 'He'll be back. That useless boy can't survive out there.'" When Linda heard that quote, she had to stop writing for a moment. That kind of indifference wasn't just suspicious, it was cruel. Sheriff Nolan began visiting witnesses one by one, urging them to testify. None were eager. Pete Langley hesitated. "I've got a wife, a shop. If they come back after me, I'm scared." Nolan spoke slowly. "If you stay silent, this will happen again. To another child." Pete looked down at the blood-stained sweater, then nodded. Mrs. Violet refused at first. But after Linda read her part of the letter Elijah's mother had left behind, the older woman sat in silence for a long time before finally saying, "All right, I'll speak up, not for me, for his mother." Maggie Sanders, trembling more than anyone, only said one thing. "I was a single mother once. I know that look in a wounded child's eyes. I'll testify." The day the summons was issued, Edward and Lucille were still sitting in the living room, the flicker of the television lighting up their faces. Edward turned up the volume when the news came on, but Lucille turned it off. "They found the boy," she said flatly. Edward didn't respond. He simply took a slow sip of whiskey. Behind that door, the truth had finally knocked. And this time, it wasn't waiting for permission to come in. The Marrowfield County courtroom wasn't large, but that morning, every seat was taken. The air was thick with tension, and outside, the wind slid through the cracks in the old wooden door, whistling softly like a reminder that the truth was waiting to come to light. Just days earlier, it had been Linda Harper, the investigative reporter who had followed countless child abuse cases, and Sheriff Nolan, who uncovered the most critical turning point. They worked relentlessly, digging through old medical records, unfinished prescriptions, and anonymous reports from years ago. In a dusty archive at the Marrowfield Clinic, Linda found a folder detailing how Elijah's mother had been prescribed high doses of sedatives, not once, but monthly. "She wasn't sick," Linda said, placing the file in front of Nolan. "She was being pushed to the edge." At the same time, Nolan contacted Dr. Mason, the physician who had once treated Mrs. Carter, and confirmed that her recorded cause of death was acute respiratory failure due to sedative overdose. But when they looked at the original statements, the details were vague and lacked any thorough investigation. Linda's voice lowered as she handed over the documents. "You know what they did. They used faith, authority, and fear to keep her silent." Once the findings were verified, Nolan went to see Mr. Whitmore in the warm light of his home library. "Does the boy know?" Nolan asked. "Not yet," Whitmore replied. "I'm letting him decide when he's ready." "But we need his testimony," Nolan pressed. "This time, the evidence could support a charge of wrongful death, or worse." Whitmore nodded slowly, then walked into the living room, where Elijah sat cross-legged on the floor, holding Murphy the cat in his lap. "Elijah," he said, kneeling beside him, "they've found something about your mother." Elijah flinched, his eyes widening as he looked at Mr. Whitmore, but he didn't speak. "She didn't die in an accident," the man continued, his voice steady. "She ended her life, Elijah, because she couldn't take what was happening, and she was afraid you'd go through the same." Elijah hugged the cat tightly, his voice breaking. "I don't want to go to court. I'm scared." Mr. Whitmore didn't interrupt. He simply pulled a small tin box from his coat, opened it, and handed it to the boy. "Your mother sent me this letter," he said gently, "when she was trying to escape. She didn't make it, Elijah took the envelope, his hands shaking as he opened it, and began to read. His mother's voice came alive on the page, fragile but clear. They control everything. I'm not allowed to call, not allowed to leave alone. Lucille says I shame the family. Edward, he says his son is a curse. I don't know how long I can hold on. If someone finds this letter, please help my son escape this place. Elijah didn't cry, but his small shoulders trembled like a cold wind had blown through him. He stayed silent for a long while, then quietly slipped away into his room. That night, Elijah didn't sleep. He curled up in bed, clutching the letter like it was the last key to a truth locked away for years. In the dark, memories poured back like a flood. His father's shouts, his grandmother's cold stare, the sharp smell of antiseptic, dried blood on his skin, and his mother's still body beside an empty pill bottle. He gripped the letter tightly, as if it were the last piece of her that still lived, and inside him, the fear slowly began to give way to something older and deeper. A quiet, long-buried anger, rising now after years underwater. When dawn's light crept into the room, Elijah stepped out, his eyes red with sleeplessness, but his voice was firm. Mr. Whitmore, I'll go. I'll speak. The trial began. Elijah stepped onto the witness stand, and the first thing he felt wasn't his voice. It was the pounding of his heart against his ribs. Across from him sat Lucille and Edward, already in place. His grandmother, cold as stone, her face filled with scorn. Edward, thin, disheveled, a man who looked alive, but never truly awake. Just one look from Lucille, the same look that once froze him in place, was enough to make Elijah falter. He turned his head away, legs shaking, one hand clutching the spot on his shirt where the letter was hidden. "You all right?" Amanda Blake whispered, the lawyer who'd helped Mr. Whitmore gain custody and who had spent weeks gently earning Elijah's trust. Amanda, in her 40s with her hair tied back and eyes sharpened by experience, waited patiently. Elijah took a deep breath, and a memory flashed, his mother's eyes, just before they closed forever. He stepped forward. "What's your name?" "Elijah Carter." "Can you tell us what happened?" He looked around, then down at his hands, knotted tightly in his lap. "One night, I spilled a glass of water. Grandma saw. She called Dad. He smashed a lamp. The light flickered. He screamed, 'You're a curse! You killed your mother!' Then he hit me, kept hitting until I couldn't open my eyes anymore." The courtroom went silent. Someone in the back stifled a sob. "Elijah, were you afraid?" Amanda asked. "Yes, but I don't want anyone else to hurt like I did." He turned toward Edward, and this time there was no fear in his eyes, only a deep, cold silence. Mr. Whitmore gripped the armrest tightly, not looking at Edward, but watching Elijah as if seeing the son he once lost rise again through another. On the other side, Edward Carter sat motionless, his mouth tight, his hair unkempt. And when Elijah, without meaning to, referred to Mr. Whitmore as Dad during another answer, Edward blinked. For the first time since his arrest, he didn't resist. He just sat there, adrift. Lucille, when her name came up, turned to glare at Elijah, her eyes filled with contempt. But this time, Elijah didn't lower his head. He met her gaze, not with fear, not with hatred, just with the calm eyes of someone who had survived and no longer belonged to her world. When the hearing broke for recess, Mr. Whitmore stepped into the hallway, hands shaking. Linda Harper stood nearby, scribbling into her notebook. "You okay?" she asked. "I once lost a son," he replied softly. "Today. I saw another one stand in his place." Linda paused, then said, "We don't just document the truth. We have to protect it." The verdict of the trial was final. With the letter from Elijah's mother, the old medical records, Elijah's direct testimony, and the voices of witnesses from the town, the court sentenced Edward Carter to 15 years in prison for aggravated child abuse and indirect complicity in his wife's death, while Lucille Carter received 5 years of suspended sentence along with a permanent restraining order banning her from contact with children, especially her grandson. Elijah didn't look back when they were led away. He simply held Mr. Whitmore's hand and walked silently into the light outside, where for the first time he felt like he wasn't invisible anymore. Morning at the Whitmore estate wasn't cinematic. The sky wore a thin silver fog, apple branches clung to the night's moisture, and the old wooden door creaked open in the soft wind. But in that quiet simplicity, something had shifted. For the first time in years, the house wasn't silent. In the kitchen, the smell of toasted bread and warm milk drifted in the air as Sophie, Mr. Whitmore's granddaughter, 27, steady-voiced and kind-eyed, prepared breakfast and turned to see Elijah lingering behind the doorframe. "Want honey with it?" she asked, not trying too hard to be friendly, just enough to keep a wounded child from feeling cornered, and Elijah gave a small nod as he sat down in front of the toast. His first breakfast eaten in peace, without any glares or shouting. After breakfast, Sophie took him to the garden, where Ava and Tommy, 2 foster children living under Mr. Whitmore's support, were practicing writing on small boards, and Elijah sat down next to Ava, watching her awkward letters drawn with her right hand. "Try using your left," he said softly, like wind slipping between leaves, and when she asked why, he answered, "I used to write that way, when my right hand couldn't hold a pen anymore." Ava didn't ask further, and Elijah guided her hand on the board, quiet and patient, while Tommy kept coloring houses and dogs with crayons. None of them spoke about pain, but somehow, through those lines and letters, the 3 children were stitching pieces of themselves back together. That afternoon, Sophie asked Elijah to help her choose paint colors for a study room Mr. Whitmore planned to renovate for the kids, and when she held up a blue sample and asked, "How about this one?" Elijah glanced at the sky, where clouds floated gently past the old rooftop, and whispered, "It looks like the sky when my mom was still alive." So soft Sophie had to pause before she understood, and she said nothing else, but chose that color. That night, Elijah sat alone in the study, the room where Mr. Whitmore used to read books with his late son, under the soft desk lamp, carefully writing on a piece of paper with slow, steady strokes. "Mum, I'm still alive. I stood in court. I said everything. But tonight, I'm not writing to tell you about the pain. I want to tell you about Tommy, Ava, Sophie, about breakfast with honey, about the room painted with new sky. I think maybe I'm beginning to understand what it means to really live, Mom. Not just survive, but live." He folded the letter and placed it in a small wooden box, engraved inside with the words, "To Martha, with all my love." The same box Mr. Whitmore once used to keep his wife's letters. Outside on the back porch, Mr. Whitmore was watering plants when he heard light footsteps and turned. "Mr. Whitmore," Elijah said. "Yes? I want to learn how to make bread, like Sophie did the other day, but I want to add star anise." The old man chuckled, not the kind of forced laugh from habit, but one that came naturally. "Martha loved star anise. Looks like someone else remembers her now, just like I do." That night, for the first time in 15 years, Mr. Whitmore didn't need a sleeping pill. The sound of quiet giggles from the back porch, the soft kitchen lights, the scent of flour and spice in the air made it feel like time had folded, returning him to a life he once thought he'd lost. And Elijah sat by the window, staring at the little stars above the quiet sky. The letter to his mother had been written. The past still remained, But for the first time, it wasn't a chain. It was soil. And from it, something new was beginning to grow. The morning of the House of Light's inauguration wasn't loud, nor garishly colorful, but it carried a quiet radiance, a kind of light that seeps into the soil like early dew after a long night's rain. It was autumn. The wind was gentle, and golden maple leaves landed on people's shoulders, on wooden steps, then slowly drifted down, as if trying to record every small moment of rebirth. Beneath the arched stone gate, where a simple brass inscription read, "No one stays invisible forever," guests began to gather. They weren't exactly friends, nor close acquaintances, but most had heard Elijah's story, a child who once lost his voice to fear, now standing beside the man who had shut himself away in an old estate for 15 years, both cutting the red ribbon that marked the beginning of something new. Mr. Whitmore wore a light grey suit, plain but crisply pressed, solemn without being ostentatious, just enough to show he was the one who laid the foundation for this place. Beside him stood Elijah, no longer trembling, but still carrying that quiet composure that had become part of him. His eyes no longer dodged others' gazes. Instead, they met them, calmly and fully. To their right stood Sophie in a soft sky-blue dress, holding a bouquet of lavender, the same flower Martha once planted around the house. Tommy and Ava, the first two children taken in by the House of Light, ran through the courtyard, chasing blue and yellow balloons, their laughter and footsteps tapping rhythm into the tiles beneath them. When the scissors sliced through the ribbon, a round of applause broke out. The clapping wasn't loud, nor long, but it was unified, firm. It sounded like an unspoken acknowledgement that this place, once a cold mansion of a lonely man, had been transformed by courage and patience into something radiant. Among the crowd, a curly-haired boy, about 6 years old, with eyes wide enough to hold a sky, tugged lightly on Elijah's shirt. "What's your name?" Elijah looked down, and for a brief moment, a pulse ran down his spine. Because once, that question was one he could not answer. He had once stayed silent, head down, afraid even of the sound of his own voice. But today, without needing anyone's permission, without looking for approval, Elijah bent down and smiled. "I'm Elijah." It was the first time he'd smiled at a stranger. Not forced, not hidden, just a simple greeting. That afternoon, after the guests had gone, Elijah wandered around the property. He walked slowly, fingers brushing against newly painted wooden walls and solid brick paths. Everything was clean, sturdy, and warm to the touch. At the far end of the row of buildings was a small classroom, once an old storage shed, now transformed into a space filled with natural light, neat wooden desks, and a wall covered in colorful drawings. Elijah sat at the teacher's desk and pulled out a leather-bound notebook from the drawer, one that had belonged to Martha. He opened the first page, took a deep breath, and began to write. "I used to be afraid of being forgotten, afraid that I'd become a shadow no one could see, disappearing into damp afternoons without anyone noticing. I once believed that the pain in my memories was all that would remain of me. But now it's different. Now I fear there are still children out there like me, ignored, silenced, dimmed out. And if I can do anything to help someone be seen, then I must do it. Because I was seen, I was called by name, and I was allowed to stay." Beside that entry, mounted on the wall, was a small brass plaque, hand engraved with the words, "No one stays invisible forever." As dusk approached, in the kitchen, Mr. Whitmore poured tea. The scent of Earl Grey filled the wooden room, soothing the cold wind tapping at the porch. He sat on the familiar wooden chair by the window, a seat he once filled in solitude. But now, he was no longer alone. Out in the yard, Tommy and Ava were playing tag with two new children, Benji and Clara, who had just arrived that week. Their laughter echoed across the grounds, rising up the tiled roof, blending into a golden sunset, as sweet as honey. Sophie stepped out of the kitchen, carrying a tray of freshly baked cookies. She sat down beside Mr. Whitmore, said nothing, and gently leaned against his shoulder. The two of them watched the children play, their eyes reflecting a peace that was quietly, unquestionably real. Elijah stepped out after them and sat on the front step. He didn't join the game, just watched and smiled. In his gaze there was no more tension, no more fear, only a stillness that had taken root. Elijah had once been a shadow, invisible even in his own home, and nearly invisible to the rest of the world. But he had stepped forward, not with noise or defiance, but with quiet footsteps, strong enough to change the course of a life. He met a man who didn't ask, "Where are you from?" but instead, "Are you hungry?" Who didn't rescue with pity, but simply stopped and listened. From a forgotten child, Elijah had become a light for other children, because sometimes it only takes one person to see you, and that's enough to make you stand up and believe you belong. Are you staying up late or working while reading this story? If so, please remember to take a sip of warm water and treat your skin gently before bed. No matter how exhausting the day has been, you still deserve to be cared for, starting from the smallest things. Leave a thought behind, because somewhere out there, someone might be reading, and they need to believe that someone is still listening.